Hello, Freedom Gate family. I hope you are doing great. What a privilege it is for me to be speaking to us during this devotion. More and more, I'm realizing that we may not have control over time, but God has given us an assignment on earth. And while we are still alive, God has given us an assignment to fulfill and to fully live it with passion. More and more, I'm realizing each time I get the opportunity to minister that it's such a privilege and an honor to speak to you and to allow the Lord to speak to me as well as we minister together. I may not know how long I'm going to be around Freedom Gate, but I know that God has an assignment that He has given me while I'm still around. So today I'm going to be speaking to us about 3 types of believers that you find in the local church. I'm going to be using 3 types of men in the New Testament in comparison to the 3 types of believers that we find in the local church. Now, these 3 types of believers are present in our local church today. You will identify them and you will be able to see that these are 3 types of believers. I pray that God will help us to also evaluate ourselves so that we may know that we may not fall into the category of one of them. So 3 types of believers that we find in the local church. Number 1, the first type of believer that we find in the local church is the Iscariot type of believer. Judas Iscariot type of believer out of the account of Matthew 26. Now, this believer only comes to Jesus for what it can get out of Jesus. It does not press into relationship for eternity. It presses into relationship for self-gratification, for things that satisfy them for a moment. This type of believer has a prostitute mentality. It doesn't see a problem in pressing into intimacy for a coin, like Judas. So this type of believer sees no need for building into relationship or pressing into relationship. This type of believer only comes to Jesus for what it can get out of Jesus. This type of believer only comes to Jesus because it has a problem. Once the problem is solved, it stops the need. It sees no need together. That's the type of believer. The first type of believer is the Judas Iscariot type of believer out of the account of Matthew 26. It doesn't really have a desire for relationship, but it has a desire for satisfying its own greed. It's a dangerous spirit. The second type of believer is the Thomas type of believer out of John 20. This is what I call the unbelieving believer. It has seen Jesus perform miracles. It's seen Jesus heal the sick, raise the dead. It's been with Jesus. It's seen Jesus do mighty wonders. And yet, it still requires evidence and proof for Jesus to prove His existence. This is the type of believer that when situations change, it questions the existence of who God is. This type of believer is easily offended. When offended, it steps out of gathering. When offended, it's easy to abort gathering because it is offended. This type of believer will not see the need of pressing into relationship even when situations are hard. This type of believer requires evidence. This type of believer has a mentality to say to Jesus, "Prove yourself to me that you are who you say you are." This type of believer, even in the historical reference of God, of what God has done in their lives, when situations get tough, it forgets who God is. And so this type of believer sees no need to come and gather. This type of believer sees no need to press into relationship. The third type of believer is the Simon Peter type of believer. Now, this type of believer has a revelation of who Christ is. We'll find this type of believer in John 6. It is a revelation of who Jesus is. Therefore, it presses into relationship because it is a revelation. My prayer for you and I is that we may receive a personal revelation of who Christ is. That Christ may be revealed in us so that He is revealed through us. I pray that we may come to a place where Christ is fully revealed so that He is fully formed in us. This Simon type of believer presses into relationship. This Simon Peter type of believer is one like Peter. He says that where else can we go, because Jesus, you hold the keys of life. And so there are 3 types of believers that we find in the local church. Number 1, the Judas Iscariot type of believer that only presses into relationship for what it gets out of Jesus. Number 2, the Thomas type of believer that only believes because there's proof for what it believes in. This type of believer is an unbelieving believer. And then number 3, the Simon Peter believer that has given its life to what it believes in. It has no other option. It has no other second option. It has given its life to what it believes in. This type of believer rejoices when people come together. This type of believer is excited for gatherings. That's the type of believer because it is a personal revelation of who Christ is. Christ has revealed himself to this believer, and it has no other option. It lives to fully fulfill the assignment that Christ has given them. This type of believer has no plan B. Christ is the only plan A. And I pray that God may raise the type of believer that will press into relationship, that will chase wholeheartedly after pressing into relationship. Amen.